On the pasuk at the close to the end of the parsha of the Yomim Tovim, where it says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael leimer, tell the b'nei Yisrael, b'chamisha asar yom lachodesh hashvi'i hazeh, on the 15th day of this month, 7th month. Chag HaSukkah is shivas yomim laHashem, is the Yom Tov of Sukkah, 7 days for Hashem. Says in the Torah's Kohenim, Ma Talmud loimer, what's this pasuk saying? Why is this pasuk needed? Lefi shenemar, since it says, a little bit later on, Basukkah is teish v'shivas yomim, you should sit in the sukkahs for 7 days. Ve'einu yedei, and I don't know whether these are the first 7 days or the last 7 days. But since it says, U'b'chamisha asar yom lachodesh hashvi'i hazeh chag hasukkos, shivas yomim laHashem, since it says on the 15th day of this month, of the 7th month, is a Yom Tov of Sukkah 7 days for Hashem. So therefore this tells us that it's the 7 first days and not the 7 last days. What does this mean? So the Mefarshim explained this as follows. The question of the Torah's Kohenim, Ma Talmud loimer, what is this pasuk coming to teach us, is why does the pasuk use the term Chag HaSukkos in this first pasuk? That on the 15th day of the 7th month will be Chag HaSukkos. Since in these next few psukim, it only speaks about the idea that it's a Yom Tov in which you're not allowed to do work. It speaks about the karbonos of the Yom Tov, whereas the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah is only going to say later at the end of that section, at the end of that whole portion, it's eventually going to say that you need, as the pasuk quoted in the Torah's Kohenim, that you're supposed to sit in sukkahs for 7 days. So therefore, seemingly, the psukim should have started over here, Chag Shivas Yomim, that in the 15th day of the 7th month is a Yom Tov for 7 days, without the word Chag HaSukkos. And this is what the Torah's Kohenim is coming to explain. Lefi shenemar, because we have the later pasuk about Basukkos Teishvu Shivas Yomim. And this is only going to say at the end of this whole section, after it already said about celebrating 7 days for Hashem, starting from the 15th day of the 7th month. So we would have thought, or we wouldn't have known, whether the pasuk Basukkos Teishvu Shivas Yomim is now referring to those same 7 days that the pasuk had spoken about earlier, that's a Yom Tov of 7 days in which we're bringing karbonis, etc. That's what the Torah's Kohenim means with Shiva Rishonim. Are they the 7 days, those first 7 days that we spoke about? So the pasuk told us already about those days, and now we're saying that in the same days he's supposed to sit in the sukkah. Or perhaps is the pasuk now saying that the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah is a separate thing. After we celebrated for Hashem 7 days, there's now going to be another set of 7 days, which is what the Torah's Kohenim refers to as Shiva Acharonim, which is going to begin after the end of the previous 7 days. And this is, says the Torah's Kohenim, as the Mefarshim explain it, this is why it says right in the beginning of the whole section, when it starts speaking about this Yom Tov that we're going to be celebrating for 7 days in which there's no work done, etc. Immediately the pasuk already refers to it, B'chamisha asar yom lachodesh hashvi'i hazeh Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yomim, referring to it with the name Sukkos, which tells us that later when the pasuk is going to say Basukkos Teishvu Shivas Yomim, you should sit in Sukkah 7 days, is in the same time of those 7 previous days that we spoke about, which started at the 15th day of the month. Says the Rebbe, when reading this Torah's Kohenim simply, it seems to be implied that the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah for 7 days is not inherently connected with the Yom Tov itself. It's not an integral part of the Yom Tov and the other aspects of the Yom Tov, which are mentioned right after the psukim of having this Yom Tov of 7 days, which is not to do the work and to bring karbonis to Hashem, etc. It would also seem that it's not connected with the mitzvah of netilas daled minim, of taking the 4 things together with the lulav, which the Torah says in those first psukim, when it's speaking about the 7-day Yom Tov, it does mention the karbonos. It also mentions that on the first of those 7 days you're going to take the lulav. And therefore, that's what the Torah's Kohenim is saying, that's why we could have thought that Basukkos Teishvu Shivas Yomim, sitting in the sukkah 7 days, is not in the same time as the Yom Tov and those mitzvahs. In other words, possibly, theoretically speaking, sitting in the sukkah is a completely separate thing. It's only that the Torah, with adding the word Hasukos to the word Chag HaSukkos, said now we know that practically the idea of sitting in the sukkah is in the same times there are 7 days of Yom Tov for Hashem, which start on the 15th day of the 7th month. So again, What the Rebbe is saying, seemingly, reading this Torah Kohanim, we could seem to imply that maybe the sitting in the sukkah is not an integral part of the Yom Tov that starts on these 7 days. But the Rebbe says, in truth, we cannot say this. Because of the actual fact that the Torah does tell us about those 7 days. And how do we know that you need to sit in the sukkah the same 7 days? Is because that the Torah is calling those 7 days that are Yom Tov for Hashem, calling it Chag HaSukkos in that first pasuk. Didn't find some other way of hinting to us this idea that it's going to be the same 7 days. This itself tells us that the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah is not only on the same time as the Yom Tov, but rather that it's very, very much connected, and it's very much part of the very, very essence of this Yom Tov and all matters associated with the Yom Tov. And furthermore, since this is the name of the Yom Tov, it's understood that this is really the whole content and the whole point of this Yom Tov as the name of every single thing that always brings out and expresses what the idea is all about. But if this is the case, says the Rebbe, we need to understand, number one, why is it that by the Tzivui, by Sukkot Teishvu Shivas Yomim, the pasuk does not emphasize that we should know that it's the same 7 days as the previous 7 days. We had a whole drush on it, but why doesn't the Torah emphasize this point? Not even by saying, it could have said, Basukos Teishvu, rather, instead of saying, it sits 7 days in the sukkah, it could have said, Basukos Teishvu Bishivas Hayom, I mean, those same 7 days that we were talking about before. Question number 2, why in fact doesn't it say right in the beginning of the section, right after B'chamisha Asar Yom LaChodesh Hashvi Yazeh Chag HaSukkos, why doesn't it in fact say immediately about sitting in the sukkah 7 days? Instead, it's going to be all the way at the end after we spoke about all the other things. Especially, says the Rebbe, when we compare it to the way the Torah was describing Chag HaMatzos, the Yom Tov of Pesach. Earlier on in the pasuk where it says by the first Yom Tov, it says B'chamisha Asar Yom LaChodesh Hazeh Chag HaMatzos LaHashem. Immediately, it calls it the Yom Tov of Matzos, and then it says Shivas Yomim Matzos Techelu. As soon as it calls it Chag HaMatzos, immediately it says we need to be eating matzah. Then will come the idea that it's Mikra Kodesh, it's a holy day, you're not allowed to do work, and the Karbonis on the 7 days. Why by Sukkot doesn't it say immediately to sit in the Sukkah? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first explaining the connection, Al Pi Nigla, between the mitzvah of Sukkah and the mitzvah of Netilas Lulav. That even though Netilas Lulav in the Parsha is also separated from Chag HaSukkos, and nevertheless, the Torah does connect it with the Chag Hashem, Shivas Yomim, not like by Sukkah. In other words, again, it's in that first section of Sukkah where the Torah says that there's a Yom Tov of 7 days where you're going to be celebrating to Hashem, and immediately it says, part of those 7 days is you're going to be doing the mitzvah of Lulav. Again, it's not in connection with when we speak about sitting in the Sukkah. Says the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe says, in a siddur, that the mitzvah of taking the lulav b'sukkah is considered mitzvah min hamuvchar. So what's the connection? Again, the Rebbe wants to see the connection between the lulav and the sukkah. The Rebbe says, l'cha'oira, you could say that it's an inyan al pi Kabbalah, and that the source for it is in Kisvei HaArizal. But says the Rebbe, yesh loimer, we could say that just like all inyanim of Kabbalah and Pnimiyas HaTorah, that it also has some sort of source and explanation al pi nigla. Especially that the Alter Rebbe actually changes from the wording as it's in Kisvei HaArizal, where there it says toiv levarech, it's a good idea to make the bracha, etc. He writes mitzvah min hamuvchar. This is the way you perform the mitzvah in the best way. The Rebbe says seemingly we could say that the idea of netilas lulav b'sukkah, taking the lulav in the sukkah, that it's mitzvah min hamuvchar, is actually part of the mitzvah of sukkah. It's enhancing the mitzvah of doing the mitzvah of sukkah in the best way. How so? Since the mitzvah of sukkah is teishvu kein taduri, you should sit in the sukkah as you live in your house the rest of the year, which is that you should eat and drink and sleep and take your walks and you relax and live in the sukkah. All 7 days, both day and night, as you live in your house, and everything that you wouldn't do outside your house, you shouldn't do outside your sukkah. And we need special reasons and hetadim to be able to learn and do other things outside of the sukkah. So therefore it's understood simply that when it comes to the mitzvah of taking the lulav, which is one of the things that the person does on the days of sukkahs, so obviously you would do that in the sukkah. Especially that it's something as important as a mitzvah. The mitzvah makes it especially choshev, especially important. and therefore it has a special kvi. It's a very important thing, a very permanent thing in a certain sense. And if things like teal, like just relaxing and taking walks in the sukkah, and these kind of things have to be in the sukkah, how much more so something as important and permanent like lulav definitely have to be in the sukkah. However, says the Rebbe, from the fact that the Alter Rebbe writes this din as part of the dinim of netilas lulav, and also from the wording of the Alter Rebbe, mitzvahs netilosoi besukkah, that the mitzvah of taking the lulav in the sukkah is the mitzvah min hamuvchar, which emphasizes that it's a matter hidur in the mitzvah of lulav. It's the best way of doing the mitzvah of lulav. In other words, that's telling us that it's not so much as a din of sukkah, that everything you do needs to be in the sukkah, including the lulav, but rather the mitzvah of the muvchar, of how you're going to do the lulav in the best way. Now, what would be the practical difference if it's a mitzvah it's doing the mitzvah of sukkah in the best way, or is it doing the mitzvah of lulav in the best way? Says the Rebbe, in a case when, in this particular case, a person is exempt from sukkah. So, for example, let's say it's raining or something similar to that, which we know that there's a halacha hamitztayed. If a person is in pain, he's patur min sukkah, he's exempt from the sukkah. Says the Rebbe, if netilas lulav b'sukkah is only a mitzvah min hamuvchar in the aspect of sukkah, it's only enhancing, it's doing the mitzvah of sukkah best, like all other things you need to do in the sukkah, eating, drinking, and so on, with which you're fulfilling the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah. So if you are currently exempt from the sukkah because it's raining or the like, then you shouldn't have to wait with taking the lulav until the rain is going to stop and take it in the sukkah, because right now you don't have the obligation of being in the sukkah. Just like you don't have to wait with your eating and drinking and other things till the rain stops. That's all if it's part of the sukkah. But if we should say that it's the mitzvah min hamuvchar as the best way of taking the lulav, then even if right now, while the rain is coming down, the person doesn't have a chiyuv of being in the sukkah, but since he is obligated in taking the lulav, and the best way of doing the mitzvah, min hamuvchar, the shleim is most perfect way, is when it's done in the sukkah, then it makes sense to say that the best thing to do is to wait till the rain stops, so you'll be able to take the lulav in the sukkah, and then you're going to be performing the mitzvah of lulav in the very, very best possible way. Says the Rebbe, to understand all of this, the biur, the explanation of all of this, in the parsha of the Yomim Tovim, in our parsha, we find only two Yomim Tovim where the Torah gives it a special name. In other words, not just saying it's on a certain date, a Yom Tov for Hashem, but specifically giving it a name. And that is Chag HaMatzos and Chag HaSukkos. But the Rebbe points out there's some differences between the two. By Chag HaMatzos, it says, B'chamisha asar yom lachodesh hazeh, Chag HaMatzos laHashem. So on the 15th day is Chag HaMatzos, meaning the words Chag HaMatzos doesn't say about all 7 days. It's the 15th day is Chag HaMatzos. By Chag HaSukkos it says, Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yomim laHashem. All 7 days are given this title of Chag HaSukkos. That's one difference. On the other hand, we mentioned already before, by Chag HaMatzos it says immediately you should eat matzahs for 7 days. By Chag HaSukkos, this idea of sitting in the sukkah for 7 days does not say immediately right now when the name is being given, but as we said before, it's going to be all the way at the end of this whole section. Says the Rebbe, to understand the difference between these, the way the Torah treats these two Yomim Tovim, we can learn it from another difference that we find by these two Yomim Tovim. Chag HaMatzos, how is it usually referred to? In the language of Chazal and in the regular common language of Minhag Yisrael and Lashon Bnei Adam, we also call it by another name. It's more commonly known as Chag HaPesach. Whereas by Chag HaSukkos, we don't find that it should be called by any other name. It's called the same name in the words of Chazal, in Minhag Yisrael, as the name that's given in the Torah. From all of this, says the Rebbe, it's understood that the Torah and the content of the whole Chag HaPesach is not necessarily completely only about being Chag HaMatzos. And that's why it has another name. Whereas by Chag HaSukkos, Sukkos is the point of the whole Yom Tov. And therefore, when the Torah says, B'chamisha asar yom lachodesh hazeh Chag HaMatzos laHashem, we said by matzos it says immediately you should be eating the matzah. So the Rebbe says right over here, the pasuk tells us we should be eating shivas yamim matzos techelu, eat matzos for 7 days. In other words, that it's because of this point of eating matzah, and it's only because of this point, that's what we call it Chag HaMatzos. Not because every aspect of the Yom Tov and all 7 days are inherently connected to matzah. It's called Chag HaMatzos because there's a mitzvah to eat matzah on the first day, and also there's matzah on the rest of the days in one way or another. Whereas, the pasuk says immediately, Chag HaSukkos, Shivas Yomim LaHashem. It's called Sukkos, the 7 days are called Sukkos, meaning this is the point of the whole Yom Tov of the 7 days. Says the Rebbe, and it's for the same reason that the Torah does not tell us immediately about Sukkos Teish Shivas Yomim after saying Chag HaSukkos. By Chag HaMatzos, we're saying it's called Chag HaMatzos because of the eating of matzah, and that's why it says right away about eating matzah. But it's not going to be the only thing of the Yom Tov. It's the first day we're eating, it's a mitzvah of eating matzah, and the first day is called Chag HaMatzos. But here we're saying the 7 days are called Chag HaSukkos. We're not saying immediately about eating in the sukkah because then we would think, like by Chag HaMatzos, that it's called Chag HaSukkos only because of eating in the sukkah, but not that that's a toichen of the whole Yom Tov. Again, by Chag HaMatzos, we said that yes, it's called Chag HaMatzos, but it's definitely not the point of the whole Yom Tov. If we would have said to eat in sukkah right after the words Chag HaSukkos, we would have thought a similar sort of idea. Yes, we eat in the sukkah 7 days, but that's not the point of these 7 days. To explain further, says the Rebbe, of why we say that by matzos it's not the point of the Yom Tov, and by sukkah it is. Says the Rebbe, the 15th day of the Chodesh Nisan is unique as a special time, mainly not because of the mitzvah of eating matzah on that day. It's unique because it's Yom Tzeis Chamayeret Mitzrayim, the day we went out of Mitzrayim. And that's what's making it into a Yom Tov. As the pasuk says, V'hoya hayoyim hazeh lochem l'zikaron, this day should be a remembrance for you. V'chagoysim v'shechag la'Hashem, should celebrate it as a Yom Tov for Hashem for all generations. And the fact that it's a Yom Tov, so now this gives reason for the mitzvahs that we're going to have during this Yom Tov, including the mitzvah of eating matzah. But what is the Yom Tov? It's not about eating matzah. The Yom Tov is the Yom Tov that was celebrating. It's a special time on its own because this is the time we came out of Mitzrayim. Whereas when we come to the 7 days that start off on the 15th day of Chodesh Hashvi, on the Yom Tov of Sukkot, is on its own not a special, unique time on its own. There's nothing that happened in this time specifically. Here it's exactly the opposite. It becomes a special time because of the obligation that we have to eat in the Sukkah 7 days. Since there's a mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah, sitting in the sukkah for 7 days, especially that the mitzvah of sukkah is something that encompasses the whole person with everything of his in the duration of these 7 days. As we said, teishvu keiton duri, you're living here like you're living in your house. You're living the 7 days, day and night in the sukkah. This is what makes it, these 7 days, into special days, a Yom Tov for Hashem. The Rebbe says, b'signoi nachar k'tzas, to put it in slightly a different way. Every Shabbos and Yom Tov we say in davening, Zeicher li'yitzias Mitzrayim. But there's a very big difference between them, between Pesach and the rest. By Chag HaPesach we say, Zocher es hayoyim hazeh asher yitzas Mitzrayim. Remember, this day we came out of Mitzrayim. And this is why we're making it a Yom Tov for Hashem for all generations. In other words, the remembering that in the time of Yitzias Mitzrayim over here, this is what's creating it as a Yom Tov. This is the time we came out of Mitzrayim. This is not the case every Shabbos when we say Zecher L'Yitzias Mitzrayim, and it's not the case of Shavuos. And even more so, we see this specifically by Sukkot, how different it is. The Torah says, L'man yedu deirei seichem, so that all generations should know, Ki ba'sukkos eishavti es b'nei Yisrael, bo'yitzi yosem eretz Mitzrayim, that I put the Yidden in Sukkos when I took them out of Mitzrayim. In other words, even though this is not the time of Hashem specifically putting the Yidden in the Sukkos, of Yitzias Mitzrayim, yet, the Torah is telling us to be sitting in the Sukkos as a remembrance to this idea. In other words, the Torah is telling us, the Torah is telling us the reason, not when the Torah is telling us about the Yom Tov in the beginning of the Parsha, but rather, where does the Torah tell it to us? When it's speaking about this mitzvah specifically, Basukos Teishvu Shivas Yomim. And the Rebbe says, on the contrary, it's because it's dafka specifically not in the time of Yitzias Mitzrayim, it's not in the time of spring. This is when we have the mitzvah of Yeshiva B'Sukkah. That's when we have it, Chag HaSukkos, as the Torah explains, that we're specifically not doing it when the weather is beautiful, etc., etc. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand that the tzivuyim, the mitzvahs, the commands that we have regarding the Yom Tov and all of its details that say in the beginning of this section, where it says, Bayom Harishon Mikra Kodesh, on the first day is a holy day, you're not allowed to do work for 7 days. You have to bring karbonos to Hashem. are not separate things out of this sukkah idea, which don't have a connection with the obligation of sitting in the sukkah, as we perhaps could have thought and could have suggested. But on the contrary, the whole gather of sukkahs, in other words, sukkahs, which is about sitting in the sukkah, this whole idea of sukkah is shayach, is connected, and applies to all of these little details. Every one of these details is all part of this mitzvah. This Yom Tov, which is really all about, the most important part of it, is this idea of sitting in the sukkah. Again, as opposed to Pesach, which Pesach is a Yom Tov on its own. And it's not connected directly only to the inyan of eating matzah. And therefore, all of the inyanim that we do on this day, that it's a holy day, that we're not allowed to do work, that we bring karbonos during the 7 days, are not connected with the matzos aspect of it. They're connected with the essential idea that this is 7 days that are holy to Hashem, remembering that we came out of Mitzrayim during this time. Says the Rebbe, now we could tie it back to the idea of Netilas Lulav. Now we can understand why we say that the Kiyum Mitzvah of Yeshiva B'Sukkah is how we understand the connection to Netilas Lulav and to this particular Mitzvah of Sukkah. The Rebbe says, as we said before, by the command of B'Sukkah's Teishvu Shivas Yomim, it doesn't say B'Sukkah's Teishvu you should sit in Sukkahs on the 7 days that we spoke about earlier. In other words, as if it's previously 7 days of Yom Tov and that it's already 7 days of Yom Tov and you should happen to sit in the Sukkah during the 7 days. Because the fact that we are chayiv to sit in Sukkah 7 days is not because these are 7 holy days of Yom Tov. It's exactly the opposite. But Sukkah's Teishvu, sitting in the Sukkah, is what's creating these 7 days as a Yom Tov, as we just explained at length. The Rebbe says, based on this will also be very geschmack, the wording of Rashi in regards to Shmini Atzeres. The Gemara says, on Shmini Atzeres, that it's a regel b'fnei atzma, it's considered a Yom Tov for itself. Separate from Sukkahs. Says Rashi, she'ein yoshvin b'sukkah. Because we don't sit in the Sukkah. In other words, what do we see from here? Chag HaSukkos, the fact that this is a 7-day Yom Tov is an outcome of the fact that we sit in the Sukkah. In other words, the actual Yom Tov is about sitting in the Sukkah. So then when we speak about Shmini Atzeres, it's regel b'fnei atzma because we don't sit in the Sukkah. The Sukkah is what's making it into a Yom Tov. To put it slightly different, the Yom Tov is accomplished through the Yeshiva B'Sukkah. Through practically sitting in the Sukkah for these 7 days, the Teishvu came to do. So that's as far as the Sukkah is concerned. When it comes to the Lulav, what does it say about the Lulav? Ulekachtem lochem bayoim harishon. The mitzvah of Netilas Lulav is because it's the first day of Chag HaSukkos. And therefore it's understood that the time of the mitzvah, the name of the mitzvah, these Daled Minim, is connected to B'Yom Harishon. It's all about B'Yom Harishon. In other words, the Kedusha of Sukkot is the first day of Sukkot, which is Goyrim, is causing that now there's this mitzvah of Lulav. Again, just to clarify, when it comes to the Sukkah, it's not the 7 days making it into Sukkot. It's the Sukkah making it into the 7 days. When it comes to the Lulav, what's giving the mitzvah of Lulav, it's because it's the Sukkot. It's because of the mitzvah of Yeshiva B'Sukkah and because it's the Yom Tov of Sukkot. Now again, not because of the 7 days on their own, it's because of the Sukkah aspect of it. Since the Shleimus or Geder of Kedushas HaChag is because of sitting in the Sukkah, so therefore it's understood when you take the Lulav in the Sukkah, it's not only a matter of Teishvu Kain to do, I'm doing everything in the Sukkah and I'm doing this as well. In other words, just adding something to the Sukkah. But rather it's a din in the Lulav. You're adding now the shleimus of being able to fulfill this mitzvah, of the name of the mitzvah, so to speak, of Lulav. You're doing the mitzvah min hamuvchar, because what makes this the important mitzvah of Lulav is what causes it to be the Lulav is the Sukkah. And therefore the best way of performing the mitzvah is by doing it in the Sukkah. Says the Rebbe, the explanation of all of this, b'pnimi yisrael yanim and avodas adam. Well, we explained before that the time of Chamisha Asar Lachodesh Hashvi'i Hazeh becomes a Yom Tov because of the mitzvah of Basukas Teishvu Shivas Yomim. So this idea has actually a certain advantage in comparison to Chag HaMatzos, where we say that the time is just unique and special and holy on its own. Why is that? When we say that the Kedusha of the Yom Tov is accomplished, but like by Sukkot, because of the achievements and what the person does down here, so then it has more of an impact on the world. In other words, because you're impacting the world, even the very time, Zman itself, which is one of the ideas of the world, one of the definitions of our world is time, is you're impacting the Zman on its own, in its own right. In other words, not even the Zman that on its own doesn't have any shaychus to Kedusha, you're now making it holy. Whereas, when the time was just holy on its own, just removed, so to speak, on its own. And this idea, says the Rebbe, this difference is expressed also in the difference between these two mitzvahs itself, of eating matzah and sitting in the sukkah. When it comes to eating matzah, what we're doing is, the whole achila, the whole eating is a mitzvah. In other words, it's not the kind of eating that you would be doing otherwise. If not for the mitzvah, you wouldn't be eating this thing right now. Whereas when it comes to the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah, there's nothing new that you're actually doing only specifically because of the mitzvah. It's on the contrary, doing all the normal things similar to the way you'd be living in your house, the regular things that are part of your regular life, of every single person, nothing to do with Yiddishkeit or Torah and mitzvahs, and yet, right now, you're doing a mitzvah, you're eating in the sukkah, you're drinking in the sukkah, and so on. Now it becomes part of the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah. Says the Rebbe, and this is also the advantage of Chag HaSukkos. All year round, you need a lot of avodah to be able to remain in a state and be in a state of kol ma'asecha yiyu l'shem shamayim b'chol drachecha de'eyu. You have to constantly keep this in mind and try to make sure everything you're doing is for Hashem. When it comes to sukkahs, so what's happening is that everything, all the regular daily things that you do in your normal life are now becoming a mitzvah, part of the mitzvah of sukkah. And therefore, the Rebbe says, it also expresses itself b'gashmis, that the whole person, from his head to his feet, and even his clothes, are all found in the sukkah. You don't find this by any other mitzvah, that the whole mitzvah is the whole entity of the person, and all of his matters should all be surrounded by a mitzvah of Hashem. Says the Rebbe, now the Alter Rebbe comes and adds, and emphasizes that the mitzvah of netilas lulav b'sukkah is mitzvah min hamufchar of the lulav. And that's why in the morning before you daven, while you're still in the sukkah, you should make the bracha. And the bracha is al netilas lulav. What does this all tell us? A person might think that the necessity to be completely involved and surrounded by the mitzvah of sukkah, which represents Hashem's ratzon, Hashem's desire. So this perhaps is mostly relevant and important in those things that are connected with our physical needs. But not to those things that are in the category of lulav, the kapos tamarim, which has a taste, which, as the Medrash explains us, represents those that have Torah. In other words, these are people that are constantly connected to Hashem through their learning Torah. So to an avodah of every single person, a person could think, it's understood that my food and my drink need to be brought in and need to be surrounded by the mitzvah of sukkah. But why is it that we need to make sure that this mitzvah and the ratzon elyon of sukkah should also encompass my learning Torah, my understanding of Torah? Meaning to say, yes, of course I have to do mitzvahs. Because as it says, someone that says, I only learn Torah, and he doesn't have mitzvahs, that even the Torah he doesn't have. But that's all part of the sukkah aspect. In other words, it's all part of, yes, the sukkah has to encompass everything, and you have to live in the sukkah like you live in the house. But it's not part of the lulav. In other words, it's not enhancing the lulav aspect. The actual learning Torah. Because the learning Torah itself is connecting them to Hashem. So yes, fine, I have to do mitzvahs, but is it really adding to my Torah? Is it really adding to the lulav aspect? And this is what we say, the mitzvah of netilah, the mitzvah of taking lulav is in the sukkah, in the mitzvah min hamufchar. In other words, it does impact. It is relevant to your understanding of Torah itself. You're taking the chachma of Torah, which is chachmasur etzoyin shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and when you sense and you feel that what you're learning is something that's really completely beyond you, like the sukkah that's completely surrounding the person. Yes, I'm understanding as much as I can, but really there's something there completely beyond me. And therefore he has the bitul and the tshuka, he has that desire to want to absorb Hashem's Torah, which is in essence completely removed and hidden from all living beings. And he wants to take that in. He has this desire to take it into his Havana V'Asagi, into his understanding. Says the Rebbe the same thing in a general way. When a person has not only the involvement in Torah practically, but also the chavivus, the preciousness, the love for Torah, the preciousness of Torah. He makes the bracha for Torah first. So then we have the opposite of what it says of the Haaretz, that the land was destroyed because of not having the Birchas HaTorah. But here, when we have Birchas HaTorah, we have the preciousness of Torah. We are Zoiche B'Karev Mamish to what it says Ufrois Alein Sukkah Shleimecha, the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, regarding which it says Vahiv Shalom Sukkoi, which will be built through Mashiach Tzidkeinu B'Meheira V'Yameinu Mamish.